I have a great group here in studio to talk about it. NBC's Vaughn Hilliard's been following Trump on the campaign trail. MSNBC legal correspondent Lisa Rubin was in court for the trial itself. And former federal prosecutor Christy Greenberg, also former deputy chief of the SDNY criminal division and an MSNBC legal analyst. Okay, Vaughn, what exactly do we know about what's happening today?
At some point here this afternoon, Donald Trump, virtually from Mar-a-Lago, is going to be sitting with the New York probation officer, who is going to be the one to ultimately file a report that he delivers to Judge Merchan ahead of the July 11th sentencing. And as part of this interview, this is an opportunity for Donald Trump to lay out his background, the fact that he has no criminal convictions on his record previously. He's able to go through and answer questions that provide insight to the probation officer to the extent of his financial background, his mental state. These are questions, Donald Trump has largely answered from the campaign stage, like he did in Las Vegas, Nevada at a campaign event. But this is a private one-on-one setting here where he is essentially, next to Todd Blanche's attorney, able to make his case, the extent to which he may not regret the actions that led to that guilty conviction, but at least lay out the extent to which he is knowledgeable about what was laid out against him and why he was found guilty. This is that opportunity here ahead of that sentence.
Given the stakes, do we know anything about any preparation he may have done? Todd Blanche had said, I think, the day of the conviction that he was going to be heading down to Mar-a-Lago. Has he been down there working with him? Do we know?
His team has been quiet. Todd Blanche was not. Apparently, I was on the campaign trail with him over the last 5 days. I did not see Todd Blanche on the trail. I saw his campaign team around him. He did, however, fly out yesterday afternoon from Mar-a-Lago or from Nevada back to Florida, so he would have returned by the early evening hours. So he has had plenty of time to, theoretically, since his conviction almost 2 weeks ago, to be working through and having those conversations.
Christy, this is not a part of the process we usually pay a whole lot of attention to, right? So I have a couple of questions. One, was this probation officer, who it's reported is a woman, chosen at random? And number two, what's this like?
So unclear exactly how this probation officer was chosen. I would expect this is an experienced probation officer, somebody who has handled high-profile cases in the past. But again, even that probation officer's recommendation for sentencing will have to be reviewed by superiors, and presumably this is going up to the top of the probation office. What can we expect? We can expect that he will go through this interview and he's going to try, with his lawyer, Todd Blanche, to portray the best possible picture of himself that he can to this probation officer. Again, highlighting things like his lack of criminal history, contributions he's made in business in New York. He will point to the fact that he was president of the United States and he served in that office and he could potentially be the future president of the United States. He will point to all of those things as reason for why a lenient sentence is appropriate. Again, I think there are responses to each of those for why actually jail should be the sentence here. But that, for the purpose of this interview, this is Donald Trump and his lawyer's chance to really make their best case to probation, because that recommendation will be viewed by the judge in determining what the sentence will be.
Will this ultimately be part of the public record, Lisa? Will we get to see what this was like? And Christy's saying, you'd think it'd be somebody who's experienced. Vaughn can attest to this. Anybody who's ever interviewed Donald Trump can attest to this. Sometimes it's a little hard to follow and follow up. So what do you make of what's probably going to be happening sometime this afternoon?
Well, I will tell you that the law and regulations surrounding these types of reports say that the public does not have access to them, that the judge gets them, the prosecutor gets them, the defendant and the defendant's attorney gets them, and then there's a very small list of other people who are eligible to get them, sometimes depending on, for example, does the defendant have a mental health problem that would justify providing the report to a mental health practitioner or a doctor. But in the ordinary course, the public never sees them. But there's one thing about the law and regulations that is very unclear. I mentioned that the defendant himself can get the report. What happens if Donald Trump decides he wants to provide the report to everyone and their mother? There's nothing in the law and regulations, as I read them, that prevents him from doing so.
Have you ever seen that happen?
I've never seen that happen, and I'm sure Christy,
which doesn't mean anything. I mean, with Donald Trump,
everything here is sui generis. But one of the other things, Chris, I want to make clear is why Todd Blanche wants to be there, and that's because in New York, part of the process for taking this pre-sentence investigation report is to get a statement from the defendant. And that statement from the defendant can include their explanation for why they committed the crime, how they see what has now been adjudged to be a crime, basically their version of events. If I'm Todd Blanche, knowing what legal issues Donald Trump faces in the future in other cases, right, I want to make sure that my client sticks very closely to a very tight statement if he gives one at all. But the regulations also say if the defendant declines to make a statement about the offense, that goes into the report as well.
So once this is done, it goes to the judge. Alvin Bragg separately is making a determination, right, for his own recommendation. So there'll be a recommendation from the probation team, probation officer. I'm assuming then it goes to the team, and it's not going to be, in this case for sure, one person just signing off on a recommendation. And that's separate from the DA?
Yes. So we will expect, I think it's this Thursday, where Donald Trump's sentencing memo and their recommendation for what they want to have happen at sentencing will be made public, will be filed. And then on, I believe it's June 27th, when we will see what the prosecutors are recommending for sentencing. They get to go second. They get to see what the defense is recommending. And presumably at some point we will see, the parties will see what probation is recommending. I do think the point that Lisa made about whether or not this is ever going to be made public is important here, because the defendant can make it public. And if he does so, and this is a probation officer who recommends a not so lenient sentence, there can be an intimidation factor. There could be a target now on this probation officer. So you've got to figure.
So the name of the probation officer would be on it.
I mean, yes, that would be something. Now, the question would be whether or not that would be something that they would redact, or maybe in this unique circumstance, this would be something where it's a recommendation from the department and not a particular officer. I don't know how they would. That's not typically what it is, but maybe they would make a different accommodation here, given, again, the fact that if this probation officer recommends a jail sentence and that becomes public, now this person has to deal with all of the threats that we've seen towards the jury, towards the judge, towards the prosecutor. So it is a very fraught situation, I think.
Chris, can I add something
really please.
Quickly? You know, the fact that Donald Trump can make this report public doesn't mean that Judge Merchan would look kindly upon it. And I think, to Christy's point, if Donald Trump were to make this report public and put particular people in the probation department at risk, look to that to be yet another factor that Merchan might cite in determining that a harsher rather than lenient sentence is deserved here, because that too would show a lack of contrition and a lack of responsibility for the public safety and accountability to the community.
Let me go back to DA Alvin Bragg, because he's a high-profile guy who'll be recommending, assuming that we don't get the name of the probation officer, which you would hope not. You could kind of read his possibilities, I think, as a lose-lose. On one hand, he came in as a reformer, right? And he's got a 77-year-old first-time nonviolent offender. So that would argue against jail. And also the argument that it could cause incitement problems if he were to be put in jail. But not doing it is not going to make his base happy. It's not going to make Manhattanites, who we all know voted almost exclusively for Joe Biden in the last election, happy. My question is, can you really put the high-profile nature of this aside if you're Alvin Bragg when making this recommendation?
I think he has to, right? He has to just focus on what are the factors that we look at sentencing. Same factors you looked at for any defendant. The nature and the seriousness of this conduct, the fact that he was, falsifying these business records to cover up election interference. In terms of a false business records case that's come through New York courts, election interference is about as serious as it gets. And the fact that he was falsifying and signing those checks from the Oval Office makes it all the more serious. Yes, he's a first-time offender, but you know who else was a first-time offender? Michael Cohen. And Michael Cohen went to jail for this very conduct, and he was less culpable than Donald Trump, who directed him to do it and who benefited from it. And yes, Donald Trump is 77 years old. Well, Alan Weisselberg is in jail right now, and he's, I think, 81. So it's not unheard of that this team of prosecutors would say somebody who's old, somebody who's a first-time offender, somebody who doesn't have this kind of criminal record should be put in prison because of the seriousness of the conduct and the gag orders. and the gag orders.
And the 10 violations.
Counting.
Yeah. Well, that's the other thing. Could there be violations between now and when Juan Merchan actually makes his decision? But you talked to voters, I know, this weekend. You mentioned you've been out with him for the last 5 days. What are they telling you about all of this?
You know, I was at his campaign event there in Las Vegas in the dead of heat
Hot enough
yesterday.
for you?
It was triple digits. And look, there was a couple thousand people there to back him up. And of course, these are his most loyal voters. Let's be very clear about that. But also what strikes me is that almost every single person that I talked to has an understanding of what Donald Trump has articulated about the case, almost echoing his own talking points in defense, targeting Judge Merchan's daughter, targeting Matthew Colangelo, who came from the Department of Justice to join the district attorney's office. You know, Donald Trump, every single day that he left the courthouse, repeated these talking points. And that was trickling down to his supporters all the way out west. Take a listen to one of the folks that we talked to.
I think he should obey the law, well, no matter what happens, and I think he would obey the law. If he's being forced to go to prison, then he'll go to prison and he'll serve his time, and we will vote him into office despite that.
You know, Gilbert was an interesting voice there because I said, well, what do you do in response to, you know, ultimately the sentence that comes down? And there was a defiance among several of his people to say, okay, play ball with the system that they've put in place here and then go and beat them in November. And that is the sort of messaging that I got from a great number of his most loyal supporters.